We continue in Mishneh Torah Rabbeinu Agadol Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimun Zichro Livracha Hilchot Talmud Torah Perek Revi'i Lacha Aleph. And I'm sharing the screen with you now. En melamedim divrei Torah ela lethamid harun. One does not teach Torah to just any Tom, Dick, and Harry. The person has to be harun. Harun means decent, proper. In other words, that the basic norms of behavior and conduct exist in this person, and not the opposite. Na'eh b'ma'asal, or in other words, na'eh b'ma'asal is really an explanation of the term harun. Harun is usually decent or proper, as I said. Na'eh b'ma'asal means whose actions are as they should be. Literally, he is pleasant and positive to behold in terms of his actions and his behavior. So one can teach Torah to such a person, or letham, or someone, as we mentioned the term tam also in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Here and there, really, it means someone whose status is unclear to us. We do not know exactly who this person is. So if we do not know that there is something untoward about this person, his behavior, his midot, then we can assume for now, or at least it was once possible to assume, I'm not convinced that we can make such an assumption today, that the person is kasher, what we would describe in halachic terms as Yudi kasher. The world today, unfortunately, is so degenerate that perhaps this assumption is no longer really valid.
Rabbi?
Yes.
What are the ramifications for this halakha regarding the Jewish education system in general? What is one to do? Very often, teenagers, for example, who are in educational institutions, clearly are half off the derech, not acting properly. So does this imply we have to just kick them out? What does this imply?
You ask a very, very good and intelligent question. What I just said a moment ago is true, that things have changed. But equally true, perhaps even more so, is what you are saying, that things have changed in the other direction. And or that which one has to bear in mind when one considers the point you are raising. In other words, if we were to live by this standard, then many educational institutions would need to be shut down. Or we could at least limit the number of institutions, because there would be many fewer students who would be considered harunim, who would be considered worthy and proper to whom to teach Torah. And we know what would happen if such a system of Jewish education, the various systems that exist, each with its own faults and blemishes, but we all know what would happen if all those were simply shut down. Particularly in this would be true both in Chutz La'aretz, both overseas, in which case such a child would end up going to some public school or non-Jewish private school, And we know exactly where that would lead. So we're talking here about pikuach nefesh, quite literally in every sense. And it's also true in Eretz Yisrael today. Many people, many children, many young people, youth would find themselves on the street, either figuratively or literally in some cases, but certainly figuratively. They would find themselves removed from any positive influence, and the general surrounding influence is a very negative one, and this has to be avoided at all costs. So essentially what I'm saying is that is two things. First of all, this halakha, as formulated by Hazal, as quoted here by Rambam, was not speaking about a degenerate world, a world full of negative influences. Not that negative influences not exist in the past. They did. No question about it. A Jew living within the Greco-Roman world, shall we say, when these halachot were at least formally formulated for the first time, was surrounded by avodah zarah and all manner of bestiality and shefichut damim, etc., etc. We all know what the Roman world was like, for example. But you did not have the internet, despite what we just said. You do not have the internet. You do not have a world which has truly run off its rails, off its rocker, to the extent that the main topic for discussion in many parts of the Western world today is what is a woman, for example. If I had said to you 20 years ago, this would be one of the most hotly debated topics in the Western world. This would be the issue that people would invest all their energies and intellect in debating what is a woman. You probably would have thought that I'm off Morocco, but we see that this is reality. It's difficult to believe that this is reality, but it is. Excuse me. So that being the case, we have to know that if we were to refuse to educate Jewish children, Jewish teenagers out there, and by the way, it's not just children and teenagers, it's true for young adults and older people as well. If we were to refuse to teach Torah to many people for this reason, as we see here, that the person has to be first harun, in other words, he basically has to be a Yehudi kasher before you begin teaching him Torah, you would be condemning huge numbers of people to spiritual destruction. And this, of course, would lead to tremendous increased levels of assimilation, which, of course, is terribly high and destructive as things stand. So that's one thing we're saying. Why things on the one hand have changed in the time of Chazal, and in fact in many ways are worse, and we must take this into account. Second of all, here we're discussing general education. In other words, children have to go to school. So the question is where they're going to go to school, who's going to teach them. If you don't teach them, someone else is going to teach them. It might be another kind of religious school, so-called, which is much more wishy-washy than your school, shall we say. And it might be someone fresh out of a woke joke university who is going to inculcate in these people the most recent iteration of their insanity. So again, you have to save people from these outcomes and these eventualities. in other words, we're talking about just trying to create a decent, basically decent, normal Jew against all against all the attempts and all the influences that exist, which mitigate to result in the opposite. I'm aware of a certain Rav in a certain town, a certain city in Chutz La'aretz, where he had established many years before, he had established a community and a school system for that community, which was quite successful. And the various institutions that he had established over the years were now facing a terrible financial crisis. And essentially, the bank was telling this person, we cannot continue giving you credit and what have you. You know, you're going to have to shut down, or you're going to have to pay up. We cannot do this any further. And I heard this from someone who witnessed this. He went with one of his followers or minions. He went to the bank manager, and he tried to explain to this non-Jewish bank manager what it is that they actually do in these institutions. And he was a very heated and easily excited individual, and he began speaking, you know, throwing his hands around and speaking in a very heated and energetic manner. And he said, "Do you know what we do in our schools?" He says, "We create mention." And then he tried to explain the term mensch to this person, to this bank manager. In other words, we are talking about as a basic minimum to try and create a mensch as opposed to a disaster. So basically, almost anything is mutar in order to prevent total disaster and create at minimum a mensch, which is untranslatable, but basically means a decent, normal Jewish human being. When Chazal said these words, they were not referring to all the things that we just mentioned. They were referring to teaching Torah. The assumption was that a Jewish child or young person, or an adult for that matter, would be living in an environment, a Jewish community, where there were basic norms and standards. And you did not have to accept every person into your yeshiva. And we're not talking here about children, by the way. Also, it's clear we're not talking about young children. A young child is usually, it's not relevant, it's not possible or necessary to discuss whether they are harun or not harun. A 6-year-old child is a 6-year-old child. He's basically a blank sheet of paper, and he will become what you make of him. And that's exactly what we were saying before. And therefore, you have to make something of him, not somebody else. So we're not talking about a young child who has to be taught how to read and to say Kriyat Shema and how to read the pasuk Torah, Siwalanu Moshe, etc., etc. We're not discussing that. We're discussing a person who's a bit older, let's say from post Bar Mitzvah age onwards, who wants to come to the Beit Midrash to learn. Not everybody comes to the Beit Midrash, and not everyone has the inclination or the capability or what have you. And then you are justified in trying to ascertain who this person is before you instruct him in Torah beyond the very basic level perhaps that he has achieved already from his childhood. But as a child, every child is considered tam. In other words, he needs to be educated, and this is what we discussed before. In the previous perek, we discussed how it is a chova for every Jewish community to to teach Torah to the children. as we said, not in the previous chapter, I'm sorry, in Perek Sheni, the second chapter, we learned at the beginning, Moshivim melamedet tinokoth v'chol medina medina. In every town, every city, there has to be a school system. There have to be places where Torah is taught to young children. And in these halachot in Perek Sheni, we were discussing children from the age of 6, 7 upwards. So that is not what we're discussing here. Here in Perek Levi, in Perek Sheni, we're talking about young children, and there's no question of who this person is, etc. Unless you have some specific information about this child, or there's some problem. I mean, it's difficult to imagine what the problem might be, but perhaps the child is growing up in a family of organized crime and drug addicts, in which case, who knows what's going on with this poor child, in which case the first thing perhaps is to remove the child from their family. But in a normal situation, we're talking about a normal Jew. He grew up, he went to school, he knows what Jews do and what they're supposed to do roughly. And now he wishes to continue his Torah education. So one can assume we're talking about someone post Bar Mitzvah age, 13, 14, something like that. So in such a case, the person should be assessed. And Rambam continues, and he says, now I'm back in Perek Revi'i Halacha Aleph. Aval im haya holech b'derech lo tova. If this person we see with our own eyes, we hear clear reports, reliable reports, that this person holech b'derech lo tova, that he lives an improper lifestyle, that his behavior is witness to the fact that he's lacking in morally and in other ways. Mahazirim otho lemutav. You don't just say, well, we'll teach him Torah and things will work out. No, first mahazirim otho lemutav. You first have to straighten him out. Umanhirim otho b'derech yeshara. He has to be taught and shown what is the proper way for a Jew to behave. Uvadekim otho, and we assess his behavior and the change that may hopefully have come upon him. And then he may be allowed into the Beit Midrash to study Torah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
In this process of helping this person do teshuvah, it seems obvious to assume that they're going to be taught some basics of Torah, like basic Torah concepts. Don't do this certain avera. So how do you draw the line between what to teach them to help them do teshuvah and what you don't teach them because they're still Rashaim?
Again, a very good and intelligent question. There is no clearly enunciated line that can be drawn. You are correct that it is necessary, in order to straighten this person out, as we read here, you're going to have to use the Torah itself to do this, to achieve this. But there's a difference between teaching Torah in general with no holds barred, as opposed to teaching things which have to do with musar, with proper behavior. So shall we say we take Sefer Mishneh. Sefer Mishneh is the ultimate Sefer Musar, as the Gra Agon Mivilna said. To teach Pesukim or Parshiyot Shelemot, entire sections even of Sefer Mishneh, to a person and give him some of the background and some of the ideas involved. That would be, I think, one way to go about doing such a thing. In other words, things which are designed to bring about a change in this person's philosophical, ethical orientation. But he doesn't have to learn, Arba Avot Nizikin at this moment. He doesn't have to learn Masechet Mikroth right now. there are other things that must come first. So Rambam now quotes from the Chachamim, Amru Chachamim kol hashona lethamid she'eno hagun. He who teaches Torah, and literally the word shona means to teach the Mishnah or Mishnah-like material, in other words, Tanaic material, but Baraitoth, Toseftoth, which was taught Ba'al Peh, and the person was needed to memorize this information. Kol hashoneh lethamid she'eno hagun, ke'ilu zarak even lemerkulis. I'll explain that in a moment. Shene'emar kitzror even lemergema ken noten lichsil kavod. Just as a small stone in some kind of a machine or tool can cause damage if it gets inside the machinery, inside the gears. It's like putting sand into the transmission of the car. You pour sand onto the gears of the car, you will destroy it. It will ruin the car. In the same way, ken noten lichsil kavod. He who gives kavod, which is Torah, teaches that which is kavod, as Rambam says in a moment, to a kisil, to a fool, to an empty person. That is to be avoided. Wa'en kavod ela Torah. And Torah is what's being referred to in this pasuk. Shene'emar kavod hachamim yinhalu. Kavod is that which is true kavod, meaningful, kavodanly, in the meaningful, significant sense of the term, is that which hachamim achieve and are deserving of, because of the chokhmah of the Torah which they possess. The Avodah Zarah being referred to here, Merculis, is of course the Roman god, in Latin Mercurius, in English Mercury, who was the god of finance and business, trade, and for various reasons, throwing stones at an idol of this god was the official avodah, the way this thing was worshipped. So Chazal obviously referred to this particular avodah zarah because that involved throwing stones at something which is destructive. So teaching Torah to the wrong kind of person is destructive. I might mention here that today we have people, usually not children, but adults, young adults, and older people, who possess and believe in all kinds of foreign, non-Torah based ideologies, and they have all kinds of agendas as a result. If it is clear to us that a person is of that type, of that ilk, based on this halakha, I think Torah should not be taught to such people, because they will almost inevitably twist and misuse the Torah which they pick up for the wrong purposes. What often happens with such people is that they quite deliberately misinterpret the Torah. They twist and bend and force the Torah to fit their agenda. They, if necessary, a round peg will be forced into a square hole, and any statement of the Chachamim, any midrash, anything at all, will be turned on its head in order to fit their particular outlook. In other words, they come to the Torah not with the attitude to discover what is true and accept that, but rather to, as it were, teach the Torah what it should think, what it should say. I think today that perhaps is the most obvious example of someone who is a Talmid Shelo Havon, and therefore this person should not be taught Torah until you can straighten them out. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
It dawned on me when you were talking about the idea that what you were asked before regarding the fact that a person might need to be fixed using the Torah before he actually gets into serious heavy-duty Torah, such as learning Talmud. Perhaps many of the youth today who are in the category of off the derech or half off the derech, in terms of character and otherwise, maybe those people should not be learning Gemara. Maybe those people should only be learning Musar and Chumash, and maybe that's a way of applying what we're learning here in our day.
I think you're entirely correct. Of course, that doesn't mean one cannot take a particular statement which happens to appear in the Talmud in order to try and enlighten this person and bring them round. But yes, the assumption is when you sit a young man in front of a Gemara on the stender and you tell him, steig away now for 10 hours a day, the assumption is that he's normal, he's basically healthy, and now we have to take this vessel and fill it with Torah. But if the vessel is full of corruption, of something polluted or something unsound, then anything you pour into it will be tainted. And this is, as we said before, it's like taking a vessel which has in it some kind of food which has gone off, which is rotten, and you place in it good wholesome food, then that food will also become unwholesome. So I think you are correct. So these are very serious questions, yes, and these questions are not fully considered, I think, by many people in the Torah world and the Jewish world.
Right. It could be in the
to be considered.
Could be in the mainstream Haredi world, for example. There's such a, for lack of a better word, obsession with the need to steig away in the Gemara that it is basically creating a counterproductive situation where taking a kid that is totally not there in terms of his character and feeling that somehow the steiging is gonna fix him, that could be exactly the opposite of what we're talking about here.
In some situations, I think again you are very correct. And in general, the absolute requirement, as we saw before in Perek Aleph, in the first Perek of Hilchot Torah, about Hayav Adam l'shalesh Talmudo, to learn different parts of the Torah on a daily basis, which includes Mikra and Mishneh, etc. And studying Mikra means studying Perushim often, and concepts like Agadah or Haggadah, which would include certain types of Jewish thought or philosophy, whatever you used to call it. Shall we say Sefer HaKuzari or Rabbi Yehuda Levi? These things should be taught and should be part of the curriculum, but they're not. In fact, there are many Haredi yeshivot that will not allow such books in the yeshiva, quite literally. I have distant Haredi cousins of my age who studied in the Ponevezh Yeshiva, for example, and they told me when I was 18 that in yeshiva, the only thing you're allowed to learn, which is not Gemara, is Mesilat Yesharim. That's the only book you're allowed to. That's the official policy of the mashgiach, of all the mashgichim from the yeshiva's inception. The only thing you're allowed to learn outside Gemara is Mesilat Yesharim. Now, Masilat Yesharim is a very important and very interesting sefer, but there are a few other things that are no less important. For example, sefer, as we said, sefer Mishneh, with a number of perushim, shall we say, or Mishnah, basic halachot, etc. So that's not a wise or correct policy. It is an historic precedent. In other words, there was this reality in yeshivot in Europe and other places, but that's not a healthy precedent. That's not a healthy tradition. It's misguided. And today, for the reasons that we're mentioning, it's perhaps even more misguided. At any rate, let us continue, which is now halacha beth, or still aleph, depending on your edition. V'chen harav she'eno holech b'derech tova. If there is a rav, a chacham, and he himself is not a talit shekula techelet, he himself has various issues regarding his behavior, his midot, etc. So he knows Torah perhaps better than anybody else in his vicinity, but he is not a good example. Even though he is a great chacham in Torah, and the tzibur, the people in his town, in his place, would be in great need of him. He is not to be allowed to teach Torah. You do not go to his shiurim. He is not to be given that the possibility, the forum in which to teach Torah, until we know that he has done teshuvah. Shene'emar ki siftei kohen yishmeru da'ach v'Torah yivakshou mipihu ki malach Adonai tzebaoth hu. So it talks about the people who know and teach Torah, very often a kohen, as at least in those days, in the time of Malachi. Those who know Torah have to be like a malach Hashem tzebaoth. Have to live the Torah. They have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. So based on this pasuk, the Chachamim said, if the Rav is such that he can be described, not in the absolute sense, no one is perfect or blameless, but if he is generally a good example, then Torah yivakshou mipihu, then you should seek Torah from his mouth. Im lo, if not, al yivakshou Torah mipihu. So these are very important, basic ground rules when it comes to teaching Torah, and to whom one can teach and who may teach Torah. Halacha Gimel or Beth. Kesad Melamadim. How is Torah to be taught? Torah needs to be taught in a certain way. Should be taught in a certain way. This is a matter of halacha, not just custom or habit. Rav Yosef Barosh, the Chacham, the Rav sits at the head of the group. Talmidim lefano mukafim atara, and the students sit in some kind of a circle or semicircle in front of him. כדי שיהיו כולם רואים את הרב ושומעים דבריו, in order that everyone should be able to see him and hear what he's teaching. But by the way, before I continue, I should mention, with regards to what we saw in the previous halacha, about not learning Torah from the wrong person, from the person who is not living according to Torah. other types of wisdom, other areas of human knowledge and endeavor, one can study from anybody. It's not Torah. One can study mathematics or engineering or chemistry or what have you from any person who knows these things, because you are not, there's no association between chemistry and Torah, between the essentially correct ideological framework and ethical standards that are expected and required for the study of Torah, and this particular wisdom, this chokhmah that you are trying to study, that can be learned from anybody. Rambam in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh, for example, speaks about learning astronomy from books written by various non-Jews in different periods. One can assume that all of them were necessarily the most upright or moral individuals, but they knew their astronomy. What we spoke about before is Torah, specifically Torah, because there is that connection. And one assumes that if this person is teaching me Torah and he does this, it's not unreasonable for the Talmud to assume that apparently is okay.
How does this apply to some of the work that was put out by scholars in the conservative movement in the past? Some of them were certainly more firm than others, but a lot of them still had their own issues.
Yes, you are correct. Various individuals certainly have had and still do have, perhaps today, have their issues, as you say. Usually these things become quite apparent in the things that they write, and you can tell quite quickly what one may learn from them and and whether there's any point in learning from them, because if their approach is completely askew, then there won't be much point studying, reading what these people have to say. Rarely will that be the case. If we take other types of chachamim who, for various reasons, happen to be associated with a particular institution, but we know who they are, we know their background, and we read and we see from what they wrote what was driving them, what was really making them tick. Then we know that we can understand that this is a source, a legitimate source of Torah. Even in ancient times, there were such examples as with Rabbi Meir and Aher, who had, most people perhaps would have simply turned away from Aher and said, I cannot possibly learn anything from this person. And that would have been correct for most people. But most people are most people, and exceptional people are exceptional people. An exceptional person like Rabbi Meir was able to tucho achal uklipatho zarak. He was able to receive the good and toss away the bad. Maybe not everyone's capable of that. That's also true. So we continue. We said Harav Yoshev Barosh wa Talmidim lefano mukafim atara. So the Rav sits at the front, in the center, and the students sit before him in a circular or semicircular array. In other words, it's important to have direct contact with the Rav. The Rav should not sit on some kind of a chair. If the students are sitting on the ground, on the floor, which was quite customary and normal, Ela or hakol al ha'ares or hakol al kisaot. Or either everyone is sitting on the floor, maybe on mats or something, or everyone should be can sit on a chair, but not just the Rav. Uvarishana haya harav yoshev v'talmidim omedim. And originally, in earlier generations, the practice was that Torah was studied standing. As it says in the Talmud, this is what Rambam now quotes, that Ad Yomel Sheraban Gamliel Azaken, Torah was studied standing. The Rav would sit, but the Talmidim would stand. Umikodem Hurban Bayit Sheni, and it was already before the time of the Hurban of Bayit Sheni, Naharu HaKol Elamed LaTalmidim Wahem Yoshevim. This refers to what we just mentioned. So this already happened during the time of Bayit Sheni. It was seen that this was a standard, this was a demand that was too much for the seaboard. So we see that in these matters as well, things can change. They have to sometimes change because of the various developments, sociological developments, perhaps ideological sometimes as well, that may have an impact on some such matters. But at least the idea is important that we keep in the back of our minds that Torah should be studied standing. And even if you're not studying Torah standing, which is not how we do things nowadays generally, but it would be ra'ui to do so, and we should be aware of that fact.
Rabbi, would you say there's something to be said for remaining standing during various parts of the davening besides, in the same spirit of what you just said, remaining standing during other parts of the davening besides the Shemona Esrei? I remember a long time ago seeing somebody who on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur would remain standing for the entirety of the davening. Is there something to that?
I think there probably is something to that, but it is not a standard, not a demand that one can make, or even a recommendation that one can make for the vast majority of people. There are going to be perhaps certain individuals who can make that call for themselves and adopt such a practice. Most people will not be able to do this for various reasons. And it should not be even suggested to them. It's not necessary. By the way, tefillah is not what we're discussing here, Talmud Torah, which is not the same thing. For example, I mean, take the Mishneh in the first perek of Masechet Berachot regarding Kriyat Shema. According to Beth Shammai, Kriyat Shema in the morning is to be recited standing, but in the evening to be recited reclining. It's not the halakha, true, but the idea is, the point that I'm making is that reciting Shema, which is actually also a type of Talmud Torah, even that was not always done standing. And what we generally refer to today as tefillah, in a loose sense, is not what Chazal referred to as tefillah. Tefillah there refers to Shemona Esrei, to standing before Hashem Mamash, and speaking conversing, as it were, communing directly with Hashem. That is tefillah. Everything else is shevach, is preparation for, or that which comes after, but it's not actually tefillah. whereas as we know that tefillah itself, the Shemona Esrei, is to be said standing. Yes, that's true, no question. But to say Pesukei de Zimra while standing, is there any real point in that? Not at all clear that there's any purpose in that necessarily, unless a person feels that it focuses their mind and they feel in themselves that it improves their entire tefillah, their entire experience, their kavanah, their focus. In which case, yes, definitely, why not? If a person can do so. But we're discussing Talmud Torah, the study of Torah itself, all areas of the Torah. Rambam continues, Halacha Daled. Im haya harav melamed mipiu latalmidim melamed. The Rav can teach, as we said before. We're often referring here to teaching, let's say, a new perek of the Mishnah. The Talmidim they've learned the first two parakim of Masechet Yadayim, and now they have to learn the third perek of Masechet Yadayim. How are they going to know this? Once upon a time, it was not written down. The only way to learn it was to go to the Beit Midrash and hear that perek recited and stated out loud for you to hear and to memorize, and also explained later. So if the Rav is teaching Baal Peh, Melamed, he may do so. Now either he's able to make himself heard, again, there are no microphones at this time, and he's able to make himself heard depending on the size of the audience, one assumes, and the size of the building, the room, then he can do so. And if he requires a methargem, which is a person with a loud voice, who would stand up and hear from the Rav what he is to say, and then he would recite it in a loud radiophonic voice to the students, then it should be done in that way. המתרגם עומד בינו ובין התלמידים, והרב אומר למתרגם, והמתרגם משמיע לכל התלמידים. In that situation, the Rav is behind the Methargem stands in front of him. He hears from the Rav what he is to convey and to say to the students, and he does so. He was a kind of human microphone or narrator. And when the question is asked of the Methargem, he's the go-between. He then turns to the Rav and asks the question that he heard. This is how things were done. You had the Rav, the Methargem, and the students, and it went in both directions. The Rav should not speak in a louder voice than the Methargem, than this person who is announcing or reciting things. ולא יגביה המתרגם קולו בעת ששואל את הרב יותר מכל הרב. Nor should the Methargem raise his voice above that of the Rav. Halacha He. In some books, still Halacha Gimel. En turgaman or the Methargem is the same thing, the same person. En turgaman, the person who is responsible for actually reciting the statements of the Rav to the people in the Beit Midrash. En turgaman rashai lo libhor v'lo lahosif v'lo l'shanot. In other words, he has to recite precisely what the Rav said to him. He's not to embellish, he's not to add, he's not to detract, he's not to change. Because we're talking about things where precision and language are very important. So he has to recite, especially if you think about a situation where people are studying Mishnah and hearing the words of the Mishnah, which they are then to repeat and eventually learn by heart, etc. They have to hear it precisely, exactly as it should be said, and not even the slightest change should be made. אלא אם כן היה התורגמן אביו של החכם או רבו. Only in a situation where the turgaman, the metargem, is the father or the rav of the person teaching. Excuse me. Only in that situation, normally the rav is greater in wisdom and knowledge than the meturgaman. That would be the normal state of affairs. Where might it occur that the turgaman might be less than the rav, but nevertheless be willing, quite happy, in fact, to be the turgaman for someone who is maybe younger than him and but greater than him in Torah. This might happen if the person is the father of the chacham or the rav of the chacham, and this chacham, this young chacham, has outdone everybody. But this is actually a source of pride and kavod for the father of the rav. So, b'kol adam mitkaneh chutz mibno or v'talmido. A person might be jealous of everybody other than his son or his student. So, if the father or the rav of the rav is the metargem, then we can assume that he knows what he's saying. If he changes or adds a word or something in order to explain more fully what's being said, then we can assume he's doing the right thing. But usually the metargem has to be more or less like excuse me, it has to be more or less like a tape recorder. Simply repeat what he was told. Amar harav turgaman kach amar li Rabbi, or kach amar li Abba Mari. If the Rav said whilst teaching to the turgaman, to this person standing before him and was saying what he is saying out loud to the Talmudim, if he said to him, "This is what I heard from my Rav, kach amar li Rabbi," or "This is what I heard from my father," and his father was also a chacham, and therefore he heard this from his father. He repeats to the people exactly, to the audience, to the students, exactly what he heard from the chacham in the same words. He doesn't say the Rav said that he heard this from his father. He says, "I heard this from my father." He is to be a precise mirror of what the Rav says. Umazkir shemo shel avi harav or shel rabo. He mentions the name of this person as if it were his father or teacher. Omer kach amar Rabbana Paloni. This is what our teacher so and so said. Af al pi shelo izkir hachacham shemo she'asur lo likrot lerabo or le'aviu bishmo. If the turgaman is the father or the student of the Rav, I'm sorry, the son of the Rav, then he may not mention the father. He may not call his father by his name. The same is true for a Talmud who does not call his Rav by his name, like other people might perhaps. So he says, "So says Rabbeinu so and so." This is what the Chacham says. Not this is what Rabbeinu and call him by his name. So we shall stop here for today. Hayu beruchim. Izku v'yames levavchem kol hamiyachalim l'Adonai. Shalom shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael
or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement. Please email us at office@machonshilo.org.